Welcome back to AI Chronicles, everybody. Today's episode is going to be a little different from the usual AI infrastructure and agent conversations. Today, we are going to talk about cities, mobility, sustainability, gender bias, and how AI can influence all of it. I'm here today with Kathleen Salazar, a professor from Columbia, whose work spans industrial engineering, urban mobility research, sustainability, and academia. She has worked on projects studying mobility, emissions, and gender dynamics in Latin America, and now has also been exploring AI related work and research directions. Kathleen, I'm really happy to have you here. You've had a pretty interesting career journey across different domains. So, I'd love to start this conversation with something that I would love for me to know and for my audience to learn is that what drove some of those pivots in your career and what is it about AI that excites you today?
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. And about your question, I think we can take advantage of AI nowadays and applying this in different domains as mobility and helping to have better mobility in our cities and promoting better quality of life for their citizens. So I think we have many possibilities to improve the way of life in cities using AI tools.
Nice. And I remember we spoke about this that you did your PhD something in gender bias and you had like industrial engineering background as well. So how did that pivot happen? Like what drove you to that pivot?
Well, I have been working in industrial engineering topics and sustainability, but I started working with a professor analyzing transport dynamics in developing countries. And while I was studying that, I realized that different users move in different ways. Like men and women have totally different patterns of mobility. And um, for me, it was very interesting because we were analyzing how to improve mobility in our context that is very different from developed countries, and what policies could be more effective to improve that mobility. And um, strategies or policies apply in different places could apply also here. And we discovered that those differences between men and women, young or elder people, and then we realized we need to represent this in a different way, and we need to understand first these differences
Mhm.
with this gender focus or age and socioeconomic classes, and these all differences, um, because users are not like an average person. Every transport user has a different need or different um, patterns of mobility. So that makes me to start introducing myself in these gender
Nice.
based topics. Um,
That that's very interesting. And yeah, speaking of, continuing to talk about your research, you mentioned that you've explored the gender dynamics in this transportation systems area. What are like what are some biases in urban systems that most people don't even realize exist until the data exposes them?
yes, transportation systems have traditionally been designed thinking about efficiency, cost, time, and for simplicity, I will say that urban planners try to think of this average traveler, which is basically pictured as a male worker that needs to go from home to work and come back at the peak hours, and based on that average traveler, decisions of investments in infrastructure and road planning or other priorities in urban planning have been directed in that way, thinking of this average traveler. But when we analyze disaggregated data, if we break it down by gender, by age, by socioeconomic class, we see that a completely picture emerges. Like uh, we have very different patterns, and especially in countries like in Latin America, it turns out that about 60% of public transport users are women. So usually we think of the men that need to go to work at the peak hour, but most of the users are women that not necessarily are going to work, and they're not necessarily traveling at the peak hour. And then they have probably different destinations, different purpose trips, and in this case we can see that um, indicators that we usually use to measure or evaluate performance of the systems, like average travel time or average trip distance or modal share, are aggregated statistics and are not showing those differences between the different groups of users. So yeah, we tend to um, normalize these trips that are mainly related to work, but there are many other purposes or needs when we go out of home. And these typical indicators are not showing that.
Right, right. I mean, honestly, like I couldn't have even begin to think about this particular like gender bias in this niche. You see, like I did my PhD thesis in gender bias in social media data, and that was like a very obvious thing for me to think about. Like, yes, you see a lot of biased comments or anything on social media data, especially with men and women in STEM. But to think about urban and transportation systems, that was like the first time I thought, I'm like, oh, wow, okay, that's a different angle. So thanks again for sharing those indicators and your research into it. Now, you have worked across many different domains, be it industrial engineering, sustainability, and also the AI related work throughout. How do you think has AI changed the way researchers study cities, mobility, or even human behavior compared to the traditional statistical methods?
Well, I think it's not only a shift in the way that we process data, because we have now more capacity and or scale for representation of these models, but also the type of knowledge that we can generate using these AI tools. Um, Let me mention something practical, like related to this topic in urban planning. For example, mobility surveys used to rely on origin, destination questionnaires that cities apply every 5 or 10 years, because it's a very big effort or investment in doing so in terms of cost and time. Mm, and you usually send teams into the field to collect data manually. And by the time the results are analyzed and published, dynamics in the city probably already change. And for example, here in the city where I live, 12 years ago, they published the last origin destination survey, and now we have a very completely different city from that time. And uh, today we can use, for example, mobile phones or transit cards or GPS system information that can show us or allows to recover many trajectories, and we can have um, data, like very updated data, to analyze these patterns in the city. So we can use this data to improve analysis and to have support for better decision making processes in urban planning. And also, mm, that's useful because we can use this data coming from those sources to analyze the difference between declared behavior and observed behavior. What I mean by declare and observe, usually we ask in surveys what people did, where they went last week, and how they move around the city. And sometimes people don't even remember, or they just not report everything.
Uh-huh.
And they say one thing, then maybe they did a different thing. But with this data, we can really see trajectories, times, and distances that they travel, and that give us more accurate and reliable information, so that can help to have better analysis. Um, so if we use AI models using this data, we can have better insights for policy making. And if we compare this to classical statistical methods, um, we can also relate different variables, like uh, weather situation, but also demographics
Mm,
or other characteristics of infrastructure of
right.
transportation and the city, that are related in a very simple or linear way. And the AI methods can bring this multi-layer and relationships that are complex between all of these factors and decision making for selecting one transport mode or other. So that complexity is also mm, easier, let's say, easier to study and understand if we use AI models. And speaking of that, I will like to mention also this approach that I'm using in my own research, which is agent based modeling, or ABM. And we could say that is also close to AI, beyond the mm, predictive models or deep learning models. AI, in its sense with the ABMs, allows to represent these agents or individuals that interact among them and are autonomous to make decisions, and they take information from the environment, and based on that interaction and the decisions they make, there are some emerging behaviors that we can analyze. And that kind of tools allow to represent uh, very different users, like this person that is going to work, but also that woman that is going at noon to pick their children at school, and also the retired man that is going to attend a medical appointment. And we can represent all of this heterogeneity we have in transport users, and analyze this decision making, how can affect the whole system as the aggregate level. And this is like a bottom up approach, while we have in this traditional statistical methods, this like uh, top down approach. So it's like a different view of these problems.
Very interesting. So, between all like the different projects that you worked on, be it, while studying the mobility or emissions or even the gender in Latin America, what were some findings that surprised you the most, especially like around how different groups experience cities differently. And I think you touched a bit on that earlier.
Uh, yeah, we have been seeing interesting changes in how people are using transport modes. Probably people living in northern countries are more related to these dynamics where people are moving in their private vehicles, and some people are using public transit. But in Latin America, there is this phenomenon where many people are using motorcycles, and private cars, they have a big portion or a important participation in the modal share, but we have been experiencing a decrease in the public transit users. And they are migrating to these alternatives as the motorcycle because it is very cheap and is um, flexible, and it gives like a lot of autonomy and a fast commuting also. So people are preferring that transport modes that are more convenient for them. And when we started analyzing why people are migrating from the public transit to these motorcycles or these other options like ride hailing, which is also increasing in usage in Latin America, we identify some interesting aspects. One of them is that shifts in demography, because we have a population which is aging, and we have this phenomenon in Latin America also as in the northern countries. So elder people are using less public transit because for
Oh,
them is
yeah,
more difficult. They have maybe less autonomy and is not always very accessible to them. So they prefer ride hailing apps. And also because of these people are maybe demanding more trips related to healthcare and not necessarily going to work, they prefer this kind of vehicles, and that happens for men and women, and like mm, in higher levels of age and in any socioeconomic group.
got it.
But in the context of Latin America, there is also a very determinant factor that influences that modal choice, and is the perception of security. When you are using the transport mode, how do you feel? How safe you feel? And what's the probability of being assaulted or harassed? As a woman, usually we experience these kind of situations with a higher frequency. And that's also a reason to abandon the public transit and prefer options like motorcycles, because
Hmm.
women feel safer using that kind of
Yeah,
transport.
right.
And that has led to double, like before, like 5 years ago, the participation of women and the total number of motorcyclists was like 16%, and now it's about 32%. So it has been increasing. And according to these studies that we have been conducted, we found that security perception is very important. um, and also, I will mention that due to that um, change in this behavior and the um, need for more health services, this distribution of trip purposes in the city has been changing. Like 20 years ago, most of trips were related to work, but now about 30% of them are related to uh, caregiving activities. And that's also a thing that urban planners should take into account to think of new routes or different scheduling for the buses or the trains or the public transport systems that we have in our cities.
Thank you. You're expanding my knowledge quite a bit today. Yeah, these are the things. Well, living in San Francisco, all we think about is AI and different models and different platforms. But this is really good. Um, I have one more question before we wrap up, and this is more around, your work at the intersection of academia and real world impact. How how do you think universities should evolve to prepare students for an AI driven future, especially in fields like engineering, urban planning, and even sustainability?
I think um, it's it's important to teach how to use these AI tools, and the technical part is as important as the ethics and the social part, like this sensitivity to understand how analyze complex problems in our society. And I think the technology doesn't have the values. We bring the values, and that's what we need to transmit to our students. And I think the engineering and urban planning students should understand that it's not just how to build these models, like that technical part is important, but also how to audit them. And I mean, like, if we have professionals that are able to ask questions like who is underrepresented in this data set, or whose mobility pattern was treated as default and we should include also these other topics, like we need to help them to think that is not about the algorithm itself and analyzing the data set, but thinking in a critical way what we are using to train our models, or
Yeah.
what inputs we are having and how we analyze those outputs, thinking that this information is important to make decisions and not to favor only one group of population, but we can, if we think of better transportation systems, speaking of this topic, for people that are underrepresented and that probably have more barriers or issues to access to the system, we will have a better system for everyone, for all. So I think that's the thing that we need to um, think of and encourage our students to include in their process.
It always with AI models, it's like always goes back to data and what you do about it and how you critically analyze it. I'm really glad that you brought up those points because that's how I think as well. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing your insights. This was really, really useful. And really enjoyed this conversation because honestly, it's not every day that we get to connect AI discussions with real world systems like transportation and social impact. So, to everyone listening, thank you again for tuning in to AI Chronicles. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the podcast on Spotify and YouTube for more such conversations on AI, technology, and the people shaping where all of this is headed. Thank you, Kaplan.